Thank you very much for the opportunity, and as introduced in the beginning, I represent the OSCE, which is the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which runs a field operation in Ukraine at the moment, and that operation has been put in place in March 2014, and as you understand, and therewith this was before the actual conflict erupted in the eastern part of the country there. At the moment, we have some 650 monitors in the country, plus another 340 or so Ukrainian colleagues and another 87 international colleagues, so staff members of approximately 1,000 across the board. Now, the issues in eastern Ukraine, to say the least, are complex, very complex. Their history intertwines with economics, minority rights intersect with national rights, and geopolitics interacts with sovereignty. And the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission, the field operation I represent today, deal with many of these issues that I have just mentioned there. Inevitably, though, given the unfolding armed conflict and its ensuing human tragedy, as you just have heard also from my colleague here, much of our focus with that mission has been on the security situation in the east and the human costs inflicted on the civilian population. With a number of exceptions, most notably the seizure of the Donetsk airport or the loss of the transport hub in the Baltseve by the so-called Donetsk People's Republic, the geography of the violence has remained largely the same, and the contact line and what effectively was the front line has remained the same. Since the signing of the Minsk agreements, the OSCE has registered only one single day with no ceasefire violations in the entire area. And I repeat again, since the signing of the Minsk agreements, September 2014, we have registered only one day, and that only during daylight, where there were no ceasefire violations registered by us. On all other days since September 2014, our monitors have recorded at the minimum hundreds of ceasefire violations and small arms rounds fired, and the daily numbers reached into thousands on some days. The violence mostly takes place in 5 areas, and you can see this here on the map. On this map you see the 2 eastern oblasts, in green the Donetsk Oblast, and in lightly brown there to the east the Luhansk Oblast, and the red line is that estimated contact line or the front line. And the areas where fighting mainly takes place is in the south there, to the east and north of Mariupol, around Donetsk, Yasinovata and Avdiivka, and you have heard the problems that are there by Oksana just before. There is also a hotspot to the west and southwest of Horlivka, that's just to the east of Donetsk. Then further up the line there is a hotspot in the southeast of Svetlodarsk, or to the northwest of the Baltseve, that town that had been violently taken in February 2015, and the last one and the only one in the Luhansk region, in the triangle of the towns that called Popasna, Pervomaisk and Troitske. A defining feature of this conflict is its volatility. The incessant daily litany of violence is punctured only by an even greater level of violence, with upsurges involving thousands of ceasefire violations, including explosions. The last such upsurge in violence we have observed exactly in the region Oksana has just referred to before, in the Avdiivka, Yasinovata, Donetsk airport triangle in beginning February, late January this year. The numbers we have recorded there were staggering. In the first week of the month, the number of ceasefire violations recorded by the SMM almost tripled compared to the week before. The number of explosions, these are the violations caused by heavy weapons, that includes tanks, artillery, multiple launch rocket systems, increased 6 times compared to the week before. Of those explosions caused by these weapons, almost 40 of those, 40% of those, were caused by this multiple launch rocket system. These are systems you can fire 40 rockets in one go. They're bound on a truck in barrel tubes, and they're the most indiscriminate weapon of all. Both sides use them. Our unmanned aerial vehicles, our UAVs or drones in common language, often capture the image of the fighting, and I have brought with me here a short video clip of what we have seen in Donetsk last May. This is taken by our own asset there, and the action takes place there in Mineralne, that's also in the area of Yasinovata, where you can see howitzers been standing there, and you can see explosions because the Ukrainian government forces target these howitzers, and you can see slightly later, you can also see personnel then returning the fire. You can see them now firing, and the firing goes into the direction of Avdiivka. There are no saints in this conflict, as you can see. Here you can see incoming fire, Ukrainian armed forces shelling this area, and you can see outgoing fire by these howitzers. You can see the barrels of these weapons there, firing now into the direction of Avdiivka. And Avdiivka, as well as Yasinovata, are civilian areas where civilians live, where civilians go about their lives. And unlike these soldiers you have seen, the civilians, they don't live in trenches. The civilians don't live in armored vehicles. The civilians don't have the information as to when an attack may happen, and they're much more exposed to the risk than the soldiers or the armed men of the non-government side actually are. Two factors underline the volatility and the ever-present threat of upsurges in violence, and that is, on the one hand side, the close proximity of the positions. In this area that you have seen before, in some places the positions are across the room. So from me to my colleague there behind, they can see each other. They are as close as this in opposing sides, and that of course leads to a permanent stage of violence. And the other reason why the violence continues is the presence of these types of heavy weapons that you have just seen there. And as I've mentioned, in some places the sites are within meters of one another, literally in the line of sight. Even the most minor provocation can lead to a major escalation, an insult hurled across the line, followed by small arms fire. Tensions rises and tempers flare until, before anyone understands why and how, artillery and mortar rounds are used and being exchanged, and you have a hard to stop kinetic activity that injures and kills and destroys. This dynamic can happen anytime, anywhere, and very quickly. Violence spreads like a bushfire, spreading quickly, seemingly inexplicitly. The obvious answer is disengagement, a proposal the sides have already endorsed in the framework decision of the Trilateral Contact Group back in September last year. That decision defines 3 pilot areas along that red line that you have seen before, in which the sides promised to pull back hardware and personnel. And as with many other commitments made by the sides, the disengagement process in these 3 areas has been partial at best, but has nonetheless brought a reduction in the level of violence where it did happen. The other factor, as I've mentioned, underlying the violence is the presence of proscribed weapons inside withdrawal areas. These are areas where weapons shouldn't be. We have verified the withdrawal of some of these weapons beyond withdrawal lines. These weapons that you have seen before, they should be far behind the contact line. They have been there a few hundred meters now to the line. They should be many kilometers away, out of effective firing distance. If you look at our daily report, and I recommend you look at our website, we report every day on the violence in the east. However, you can see there that others are still in position within the withdrawal lines, within firing range of each other. And in the week from 8th to 14th of May, for instance, we recorded forbidden weapons inside the withdrawal lines on almost 200 occasions, 157 in non-government controlled areas and 42 in government controlled areas. Given the continued restrictions faced by our ground patrols in the form of threats risk from mines and other explosive remnants of war, denial of access, we rely heavily on technology. Our UAVs, which you have seen before, have in particular been instrumental in recording the presence of weapons in violations of the withdrawal lines. This is now an example here, which we have reported yesterday in our report. Here we can see, hidden behind houses, an artillery system. That's a 122 millimeter artillery system in an area controlled by the government in violation of the Minsk Agreement. And on the next slide, you can see the similar type of weapon, a 122 millimeter artillery device here in an area not controlled by the government, in the so-called area controlled by the so-called Donetsk People's Republic, also in violation of the Minsk agreements. And you can see they try to hide these weapons so that we don't see them, but they are not there for museum purposes, they're there to be used. And these weapons, of course, should have been long time ago been withdrawn. And we don't see these weapons always, and we don't need to see these weapons always, because our monitors also conduct impact sites assessments. So they go there where the shells impact in the areas, and they see damages to homes, infrastructure, and people's lives. And it's not easy reading, but I recommend you do read our reports. They're there every day, 6 days a week, in 3 languages, English, Ukrainian, and Russian. If you truly want to understand the implication of the continued failure of the sides to withdraw their weapons. The human costs makes for particular harrowing reading. So far this year, the mission has verified and triangulated 205 civilian casualties, 165 injured, and 40 killed. That's just this year. Last weekend was a particularly bad weekend. In all, we recorded 5 civilian fatalities and 4 injuries. In one case, our monitors came across a building in Avdiivka, which you also have heard before, where little earlier an artillery round, a single one, has impacted, killing 4 people and injured 1. Casualty figures do little to convey the reality, but consider this. Because of that one artillery round that I've just mentioned, a 4-year-old child had been left an orphan now. Among the weekend casualties was a 78-year-old woman in neighboring Yasinovata, injured in her own home. And you can see here the area that also Oksana has been describing before. As you can see here, Avdiivka, government-controlled, Yasinovata, non-government-controlled, are essentially satellite towns of Donetsk city, with just a motorway dividing them. It is tempting to see the experience of these 2 towns as an encapsulation of the entire conflict, a tale of 2 cities, if you will. But the reality is that it is a tale of one community, a tale of shared suffering, with neighbors cut off from one another, sharing the same insufferable fate for 3 too long years. That old woman injured in Yasinovata may have shared a bus with some of those injured or killed in Avdiivka at some point before the conflict began. Their children probably went to the same university in Donetsk, or perhaps in Kiev. Perhaps they worked together in the giant Coke plant in Avdiivka. They probably shopped in the Golden Ring shopping mall in Donetsk city. All of this history, and all of this is history, albeit recent history, is important. In just a few short years, families and communities have been torn apart. A line of trenches, minefields, block posts, snakes through their towns and cities and countryside, cutting people off from one another, disrupting trade patterns and the flow of vital utilities such as gas, electricity, and water. Here again, the so-called contact line, as you can see here on this map, runs through many of the most populated areas in Donbas. The populated areas are the whitish, grayish blots on this map here. This inevitably means that much of the fighting we observe takes place in urban areas and semi-urban areas, with soldiers and armed men and hardware often dug and positioned among civilian infrastructure. Fighting from these positions inevitably invites retaliatory strikes, and that means that people and infrastructure will be hit. Now you can see that Donetsk here, which is the town here, that big plot here, that's Donetsk city. You can see that the contact line runs along the western side of the town. If the fighting starts along the line there, you understand that the town itself will be affected and that civilian infrastructure there will be hit. It is also more often than not civilians who are most vulnerable to the risk from mines and unexploded ordnance. There are very few weeks that go by when someone isn't killed or injured, a farmer perhaps herding cattle, or someone taking shortcut, trying to avoid the long queues at the crossing points, doesn't want to pay the bribes that we have just heard of, or doesn't want to go through the bureaucratic procedures there at the 5 crossing points along this almost 500-kilometer long contact line. Of all the tragedies we have seen, one particular stands out. Imagine the scene now. It's July 2016 in Yanikev, about 40 kilometers northeast of Donetsk city. 3 boys, all brothers, aged 1.5, 5, and 11, find a strange object, metallic, shiny, and strange. They take it home, and the next day, the strange metallic, shiny object, which was in fact a grenade, explodes as they play with it. It kills all 3 of them. We in the SMM have almost 600 monitors on the ground on Donbass. All are unarmed civilians. I choose the phrase on the ground quite deliberately. We face many threats with armed men pointing weapons and sometimes shooting in our direction, or sometimes we have heavy weapons being fired from positions very close from our bases. This is, of course, very intimidating and means the inevitable retaliatory fire on these positions endangers my colleagues. But it is from the ground that our greatest threat comes. Until a month ago, children, farmers, pensioners crossing the contact line to collect pensions and groceries were the main victims of mines and unexploded ordnance. But on the 23rd of April, 3 members of an SMM patrol in Priship, which is a little village non-government controlled in the Luhansk region, were counted among the casualty statistic. Their vehicle was hit, which was most likely a mine. It killed one of our colleagues and injured 2 others. The incident, like the one in Yanikev of the 3 boys I mentioned before, and indeed all other, should never have happened. The mine there should not have been there. Both the Minsk Memorandum of September 2014 and the Trilateral Contact Group decision of March last year prohibits the laying of mines and other explosive devices and stipulates that all previously laid mines should be removed. Yet the sites have not done so. The Joint Center for Control and Coordination, as the name would suggest, is a coordination body, has also failed, as it is tasked to do, to coordinate mine clearance. The failure to deliver on mine action is symptomatic of wider failures. Despite clearly documenting ceasefire violations in our publicly available reports, despite pinpointing the presence of proscribed weapons, as you have seen before, in violation of withdrawal lines, despite outlining continued impediments to and restrictions on and threats and harassments of SMM monitors, the sites have on the whole failed to react. Instead of remedying the situation, instead of identifying the culprits, the sites hold no one to account. Impunity is the norm. Recently, for instance, a so-called DPR member armed with an assault rifle went so far as to sexually harass one of our female colleagues in Petrivsk region. When this was brought to the attention of senior so-called Donetsk People's Republic members, their response was totally dismissive. instead of identifying the culprit and holding him to account, thereby sending a very strong signal to all armed men of the so-called DPR, they characterized the incident as a bad joke. The American writer John Steinbeck once said that all war is a symptom of a man's failure as a thinking animal. After almost 3 years of violence in Donbass, I would instead say it is a symptom of broken promises. All the death, injury and destruction we've seen are needless. Everything to stop it is in place. We have all the necessary agreements on ceasefire, withdrawal of weapons and mine action. The sides have already agreed to them on the dotted line. They have promised but have not yet lived up to their promises. If this is a bad joke, the people of Eastern Ukraine are certainly not laughing. Thank you.